Unconscious behavior comes from a place of need. There's a perceived void, and there's an idea that it can be filled with possessions and experiences. It's a strong motivation. Another characteristic of being unconscious, which is to be identified with thought and form, is a disconnectedness from the truth, but there's not an awareness of that disconnection. There's just an awareness of the consequence of that disconnection. It's a separation from others. What separates us from others is also what separates us from the truth. And that is unconscious identification with thought and form. Those things, the thought and form, they are vulnerable. The form is temporary, impermanent, and thought, identified with the conceptual self, constructed of thoughts, it's built from positions, positionality, ideas about the self and the way the world should be relative to that self, the way it is relative to that conceptual self. And those ideas can be threatened by other ideas. So the deeper the identification with those things, the greater the sense of separation, the greater the neediness. It's a greater unconsciousness. There's more reacting. And when this is known experientially, the relationship between identification, the strength of the relationship with identification and suffering, reaction, when that is seen, experienced, there's an understanding that the cultivation of things identified with is an inversion of spirituality. So when you look at the world and see what it encourages, or parts of the world that encourage this, things in the world that encourage more identification with superficial things, the effect of that is to pull one further from spirituality. And by spirituality, I don't mean the holding of concepts about divinity and the nature of reality, but rather an adjustment to the way that reality is perceived, to one that is less conducive to unconscious behavior. The more strongly identified people become with content, the needier and less considerate their behavior becomes. So to find spirituality, one could look at the very things that are encouraged through media, that is identification with superficial things, and invert that process of accumulation, that accumulating of identification with things, the accumulation of things to identify with, instead of that additive process and belief in things being more and more important, superficial things being more important, the opposite track of letting go of things and seeing them as dependently originated in happenstance, born of the causal chain. Their random nature brings into question the merit of being identified with them. Their unchosen nature. The cards one was dealt. Not to mention that things appearing in awareness can't be what's aware of them. So who are you but that which is aware of what is by default taken to be a self? In the absence of those identifications, in the absence of being in a position to be moved and troubled by the fate of those ideas, there is a lack of need, because that void is no longer there. It's filled with the feeling of love, which is a product of surrender to the truth. The truth being not a concept, but what is. Not a thought about it. There can still be thinking, but there's not an identification with the subject of those thoughts. That to which those thoughts relate cannot be what's aware of them, because what's aware is not a thing that can appear in that awareness. And just drop out of the story and see what happens. See what happens if there's not a strong enough identification for things to be important. It doesn't mean that things can't be cared for. It doesn't mean that risks can't be mitigated. It's just that the fear is optional. The acknowledgement of vulnerability, it doesn't have to coincide with ignorance and fear. But to look within oneself and be mindful of how feelings and thoughts relate, and to treat those thoughts in such a way as to decrease their power over attention, can decrease the amount of stress associated with all the various possibilities to be in the timeline, to be in the future all the time, extrapolating out scenarios, it stresses the body out through the endocrine system, and it depletes energy. It should be enough to consider the possibilities and have the contingencies without perpetual rumination on what may happen. And in that lack of rumination and exhaustion and stress, there's more energy and strength to deal with what may occur. Be mindful of things that seek to plant identification in your heart. Be mindful of those little snowballs, those little seeds that want to get bigger, that want to roll down the hill of ideas and get more and more and become placeholders that squeeze out the truth, that crowd out the truth. The truth of this moment, there's something about it that's apart from its circumstance. And that is felt palpably as love. And all the cares that occupy the inner space, they are mutually exclusive to that truth. Because to the extent that reality has to be filtered through ideas, and to the extent that those ideas are identified with, that perception of reality is augmented. It is not the truth, not the absolute, it's the relative truth. And that takes something out of the spectrum of what's perceived. And that absence is unknown. So long as there's been thought identification, you don't know what you don't know. What's not known is not known. And the absence of identification, the state that follows the absence of identification with thought and form, is unknown in that identification. So there's no impetus and that thought structure itself, it needs attention, and to get attention, it has to have things to do. It has to have a strategy, and that goal of it is accumulation of content, accumulation of attention drawn in by the content. It wants to build a bigger and better self. But that is just more to obscure the absolute, to make it relative. The hallmarks of this are a peace, a contentment, a lack of being one to be offended. There being, as like the Buddha put it, like trying to make a painting in the air. There's no canvas. Since the self is what's aware and not what appears in awareness, there's no self-identified object to be threatened or challenged in some way. And yet, in the absence of that identification with that thing, there's more clarity and energy to deal with whatever those challenges may be.